Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unpacking the Word. I'm Luna, and I'm joined by my co-host, Barrett.
Hey, how's it going?
Hey, Barrett. This is a podcast where we dive deeper into what it means to live in an ethnocidal society and how we can combat that by creating sustainable culture. So today, I'm kind of excited because, well, it's not a very exciting topic to begin with. But we were just talking about how the New York Times published the U.S. Surgeon General's guidelines and kind of how he has highlighted America's loneliness problem. So I think it's interesting because one, the U.S. Surgeon General sometimes finds kind of like an issue topic to focus on throughout like their career. I remember for a really long time it was smoking, and that was kind of the U.S. Surgeon General's like main, it was a previous Surgeon General, but that was like their main MO, like don't smoke, smoking is really bad. Like tobacco companies are terrible, hate us, like something needs to be done. But I think it's fascinating that this is something that's, you can't push a product on, or you can't,
Right.
There's no singular product, right, that or company that has induced loneliness.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Barrett, let's talk about it. Yeah, let's talk about America's loneliness problem.
It's funny because you mentioned smoking, because like a lot of people smoked because of like the social aspect of it. Like the act of asking someone, can I get a light? And they'd have a conversation. Or some people would believe that like smoking like would make you cool, and so girls would want to talk to you. And so one of the big pitches was that smoking had a communal component to it. And we had to tell
Mm-hmm.
people, it may, but that's a community of people that are gonna have cancer and not live as long. So it's not as prosperous of a community. So, anyways, I just thought that the smoking example was interesting. But yeah, no, I saw this piece by the Surgeon General, and loneliness is a very real issue in American society. But I think the fascinating thing is we act as though it's not something that our society encourages, or that it's some sort of anomaly. There's a lack of self-awareness or cultural awareness when we're talking about loneliness. But if we have a society that's based on individualism, well, then people are going to want to be individuals and not part of a community. And if you all exist as individuals, it's pretty clear that people are going to become lonely, because they're going to want community, and they've been told that they shouldn't have it. And so we're telling people to become lonely, and then we're surprised when they are. And I think that's really, really bizarre.
Yeah, so the Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murphy, I want to say is his name, kind of highlighted that it's an epidemic, right? And it's not just, something that started during the pandemic. Definitely the pandemic heightened, right, people's sense of loneliness, and also like their just with the quarantine orders, stay-at-home orders, right? People definitely felt a type of way about like I need to not socialize, or had other means of socialization that weren't, that didn't feel very communal, I guess. But he also highlighted a lot of what I feel like were individualistic solutions, like you need to call people more often, and you need to accept phone calls more often, which I thought was really interesting because, like you said, the issue with loneliness isn't just like an individualistic problem. It's like
Right.
greater culture. It's a greater cultural problem that like America has manifested because we are an individualistic society. We encourage individualism versus like, let's think about, community, and like, what does community actually mean? And how do we create like sustainable, good communities?
Yeah, and in the piece, I remember he talked about how his pursuit of professional success meant that he spent less and less time around the people that he cared about. And so then time made it so that he needed these people, and they weren't there because he had neglected them for a long time. And that made him feel lonely, and that made him feel depressed. And so one of the things that he as an individual started doing to get out of his loneliness cycle was that he called people, or he answered the phone when people called. But I think a key component that he described was that his wife encouraged him to do communal stuff and to get out of the cycle. And it's like, well, the thing that got him out of the cycle wasn't just that he called people or answered phone calls. It was that he had a community of one that could encourage him to do communal stuff. And so like even seeing it at such like an individualistic perspective, where it's like, I as this singular person can do X, Y, and Z. Sure, like we all can do stuff as simple as that. Get it. But the overarching point is that he actually had a community that he just neglected. And I think for a lot of, and this is just my guess, but a lot of immigrant communities rely on their community to survive in the U.S. Like it's not surprising that there will be a Chinatown or a Koreatown, because they all have to rely on that immigrant community to survive. And that's just natural. And then as they try to thrive and survive in the US, they're encouraged to leave that community in pursuit of, monetary success or professional acclaim or something.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And, he got out of his loneliness by going back to the community that existed, I would say. But what if you're really American for many, many generations and you've just existed without that community because we've been told for a long time to not have it?
Right.
That's a much bigger problem. And I think lots of people struggle to grasp, like philosophically, our society has tried to tell people to live in the absence of community. And, that the loneliness that happens from COVID, it's kind of fascinating in that loneliness is because they didn't have the community that was their job.
Ooh, that's kind of sad to hear, honestly. Because thinking about when I lived in DC, I worked with a bunch of people who weren't from the DC area, right? Like everybody had moved to DC in pursuit of a job, a career, to kickstart, something involving work, right? And so a lot of the times, right? And sometimes, they would have a college friend who would be out there, or like a high school friend, or somebody else from like, their home state or their home city even would also happen to be in DC, right? And they would reconnect that way. But for the most part, what I witnessed, noticed, experienced, and also like myself, like took part in, was like my friends, the majority were from work. And like, it made me like, there was definitely, that's needed. You do need to have friends at work. But like if your friend group is solely coworkers, like I think that can be pretty problematic.
Yeah. And especially if something happens that makes it so that you can't go to work. Which, because nothing's wrong with having a job. Work is work. But we do know that businesses, their primary focus has to be making enough money to keep the doors open, the lights on. So
exactly,
that community is fragile. And like there's that structural fragility. And at the same time, there's no expectation that people are going to work at that job for their whole life.
Right.
So, like, it's a community that won't last. Not because anyone that's a part of it's doing anything wrong. They're just doing what's naturally supposed to happen, which is they're going to get a job at some other place, or the company will make some decision, or a trend will happen and they'll have to do layoffs, or they might go out of business, and then that whole community is gone without, due to anything relating to the people that created it, doing anything wrong, doing anything that would make people want to leave the community. So clearly that's a community that can't last, which, due to the instability of it, makes you think that we should probably coin a word that articulates that, like, it's the opposite or like a sub iteration of a community, because it's just not, it can't be sustainable. And so this loneliness happened because people couldn't go to work and they were actually having to live in the world. And that living in the world might have been just in your apartment, but or your house, but that's still living in the world, and not like living to go to your office for 8, 10, how many hours a day that you're going to do it.
God.
Like. Right.
No, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, we talked about this like 2 weeks ago, right? Where work, like, if work is inherently good or not, but the fact of like a business, the business operations is to keep the lights on, right? It's to turn over a profit essentially, or at least to like sum out to zero. But right. I mean, when you cultivate like relationships in that kind of environment, ultimately, like, is it sustainable? Right. If your community is just like work friends and people you work with, is that sustainable?
It'd be like if you had a community of friends and it was just understood that if one of your friends ran out of money, then they just had to leave the group.
Yeah.
That would be horrible.
It's definitely a way to look at it, yeah.
but that's what a community attached to a job is. When that community structure that's solely dependent on that job having money, when that runs out of money, everyone has to leave the group. Or the group has to relocate and try to see if it can survive in some way where you're not forced essentially to gather every day in the same place. Can it survive? Clearly, there's a problem with that. Just like if you had a friend group and a friend comes up to you and says, "Oh my gosh, I'm so broke. Can you loan me $15?" And you say, "Yeah, out of the group. See you later."
Kind of, though, yeah. Yeah.
That's the dynamic, because it's all contingent on having money or not. And so the fact that the loneliness in America happened because people weren't forced to go to work speaks to a bigger problem. And I'll say, this feels weird to say, but I had a wonderful COVID pandemic experience right at the beginning. And people, when I tell them what it was, they're surprised that I even would have thought to do it or that it turned out okay. But at the beginning of COVID, my partner, Andrea, her sister lives in New York, and she has a son who I think was 12 at the time. And she had recently gotten divorced, but COVID was going crazy. And you turn on the TV and you'd see people in New York just acting normal. And I was like, this is crazy. There's a pandemic that apparently could kill people. Like, the air is killing people. And there's people walking outside as if there's no problem. So I think a couple of days after COVID hit, I told Andrea to tell her sister, "Hey, if you want to stay in our house during this pandemic, you can do it. but you have to make that decision now. You can't come down here in a week or two from now and bring COVID to the house. You got to now. And she said, all right, we're coming. And so her sister, her son, and her ex-husband came down, because even though they weren't, they got divorced, they're not going to leave the dad up there in New York to get COVID and die. Clearly, come stay with us. You're the kid's dad. We need you to be alive.
Right. Yeah.
And so in my row house, we had 5 people just packed in. The 3 of us were working. The kid was doing school. The dad was a chef, so he wasn't working in a restaurant. So we just had him make lunch and dinner for us. That was his task. And we just survived in COVID. The 5 of us had a pretty good time. The kids' grades even went up during COVID, which is the complete opposite of what people say happens to most kids. Their grades went down. This kid started getting straight A's when he was in our house. And it's not having to go to an office was wonderful. Packing ourselves in a house with a bunch of people. It was great. Clearly, yeah, we all got on each other's nerves at some point, but hey, go to another room, chill out, whatever, sort it out. But
yeah,
we're all in here to survive. So being in a bad mood is not nearly as significant as going outside and dying. And so, anyways, I think the loneliness that a lot of people are suffering, and that's not to diminish it, but I think our culture has encouraged people to live apart from other people. And tragically, the ways in which we've told to get together with people are through the medium of work. And when that work medium is gone, we just know how to be more apart. And we don't know how to do the stuff that we need to, nurture our soul and be, happy people. And it's a massive cultural, philosophical problem.
No, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, I think maybe we've talked about this either on this podcast, or I know we've talked about it for sure, but like there's also, it feels awkward at times to say hi to your neighbors. And I don't know if you feel the same way, but or even people at the park, like you have a kid, I have puppies, and I go to the dog park and I say hi, and it's like people don't want to talk. And it's like, wow, like I get it. I'm a stranger. You're a stranger. It's awkward. It feels weird. But, in other countries, like when I go back to Vietnam to visit family, people are very cordial. They say hi because it's not a big deal. It's not like you're taking away anything from them. It's just a simple hi. It's a, salutation to acknowledge your existence at the very least. Mm-hmm. And it's not rude. I think it's more rude for you to act like this person isn't here, or to be bewildered that this person is acknowledging your existence.
Yep. Oh.
So like how, yeah.
I can talk about this forever. So first off, I live in an area. It's a nice area in DC, but it's gentrifying, and I think the main issue with gentrification, it's not like a complexion issue. It's the philosophy that people bring with them about how they interact with the space in which they live. And so, like these African American communities, since the government's not giving people any resources, the government's not helping anybody to do anything, there's going to be a greater need to rely on your neighbor, because that community is in it together. Like they have to rely on each other to survive. They're not getting any, the government's not subsidizing anything. The government's not coming in to pave the road or fix this or any of that stuff. So you have to rely on yourself. And so what will happen is these predominantly African American communities will turn something that the government's just neglected and make it nice. And at some point, because within white spaces, they care about property values. a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And they want to live in a place where their house makes money just passively while they live in it. If I can control the people who live around me, then my house just becomes a money-making factory. Like, that's the goal. But what ends up happening is that these people, by making their house into a money-making factory and only rich people can afford to live there, their kids are priced out of their own neighborhoods. They can't afford to live around their parents because their parents have made their house a money-making machine that when they first moved in, theoretically, it'd be affordable for someone in their 20s. But by the time their kids are in their 20s, it is just out of their price range. And so now the economics that white Americans have made for themselves has made it so that their kids can't afford to live next to their parents. And so these kids, also, it's an individualistic society. So they're also told that if you are older than 18 or you've graduated from college and you need to live by your parents, you're a loser. Something is wrong with you. What you need is you've gone to college, you've done really good at college, and someplace in another part of the country is offering you a bunch of money to go work someplace really far from your parents, and you need to go live over there. I don't care where it is. If we're from Los Angeles and you get a job offer to make a lot of money in New York, go live in New York. That's what we're told. But don't come back to California and think you can live in my house for a couple years. Like, I've raised you, I sent you to college. I'm done parenting. Now I can be free. Yeah. It's like, that's the narrative, which is just crazy. Very individualistic, very devoid of community. You're literally fracturing the familial community. Yeah. And so due to this, all these white people are in their 20s, 30s are going to look for some place that's affordable to live. And that place that's going to be affordable is that community of color that's worked really hard over generations to turn some like dilapidated area into someplace really, really nice. And so they'll move in and they'll want to live in this nice area. And it's, I'd say 9 out of 10, not malicious, not trying to be disruptive, but they're coming in there with the mindset that they aren't going to be friends with their neighbors. Their neighbors are just people who coincidentally also happen to live in the same area.
Yes, yeah.
And that's just what a coincidence.
That's the philosophy.
But we don't have anything in common. And because they don't feel that they need to work with their neighbors to make the community someplace good. Like, they're coming in there because it's already good. And they hope if they can just police the people who live in that area, that their house will just start making money while they passively live in it.
Just like their parents.
Just like their parents.
Exactly.
And at some point, maybe that house makes so much money as they just like passively live in it that they can move to another place that's even bigger. And then that place is even more regulated. And then they can make even more money. And maybe, who knows, one day they might make so much money they can afford to live in the nice place where their parents live, because that neighborhood's already got like a couple decades head start and being affluent. It's just crazy. So this philosophy of coming into the neighborhood as it being a transaction, some money-making opportunity, and if you just make sure that the people that live in it are appealing in a financial way, you'll make money. But it's not because you're wanting to be friends with them. And so that's why you'll have neighbors that they won't say hi. And it's not like they're trying to be mean. They just haven't figured out that there's a benefit to knowing the people that live next to them, because they've bought their private sanctuary, and their goal is to live their perfect walled utopia and then let the other person next door have their walled paradise. And we all can have these like individual walled paradises and just have our individualistic dreams, and we don't want to interrupt or interfere with anybody else's dream. And so that's how my neighborhood is in many ways. But one thing that I'll say is really interesting is once we had a kid, Because before, when we had a kid, nobody said hi to us. We were the young people that were going to destroy the neighborhood or something. We were the people without kids that are just making it a mess. Because that was the perception. It's ridiculous. But now that we have a kid, oh man, everyone loves to talk to us. And I'm a person that philosophically, I like to say hi to people. I understand there's a benefit of me knowing my neighbors and knowing the mailman and the delivery man and the people at the corner store. I know everybody in the neighborhood. When I go walk to pick up my kid from daycare, it's perfectly common that somebody says something to me. Just like, hey, you going to pick up the baby? Like the other day, some black woman said, you pick it on the way to daycare? And I was like, yeah. I had no idea who she was. But she probably is. I had no clue. So philosophically, I say hi to all these people.
Right.
But the thing that's really interesting is once you have kids, you start meeting people through your kids. And so now you know people in the neighborhood, not because of who they are as a person. You know them through the fact that they have a kid whose kid also goes to daycare with your kid, who also does this thing. And so like you know them as like a connection to a child, but you don't know them as a person that you say hi to and you interact in this way, absence of the child, where like because I might be a really interesting parent. Maybe I'm interesting. I don't know. But I was also potentially a really interesting person before I was a parent.
Yeah.
There's just as much of a reason to say hi to me then and know about me then as there is now. And, like my kid's not even 2. I've done a whole bunch of stuff in life that preceded him being alive that's probably worth discussing casually. But those aren't the natures of the conversation. These conversations are like, our kid goes to the same thing. Let's talk about the kid stuff. Let's talk about daycare. Let's talk about pre-K. Let's talk about this thing. Let's talk about that thing in relation to the kid. And it's like, yeah, that's cool. But like, how much time does that need to take to talk about? Like, we should be able to know each other at a more robust level because we're neighbors.
Exactly.
And that just doesn't happen. It's really weird. It's fascinating. Yeah. And so yeah, our philosophy in America is very individualistic to the point where we haven't been able to inform people that it's good to know the people around you just because they live around you. Not because your kid and their kid do something together, not because you work together, not because you both like the same sport or something. It's like you need to know them because they live around you. They're part of your community. And if you both plan on living in that space for an extended period of time, it just makes sense to...
It makes sense.
Know this stuff.
It makes sense to me. Yeah. And I think it should make sense to everybody. You should know your neighbors, and I think that's part of being like a good neighbor and being like a good community member, like acknowledge the people who live around you. Like you said, like a lot of people kind of retreat to their homes and think of it as like their walled paradise, their little walled sanctuary, but also acknowledge, that your sanctuary can be communal. It doesn't mean like your neighbor is popping in and stopping by and having a cup of tea in your living room every day, but like at least say hi.
You were saying being a good neighbor, a good community member. I think a key way to think about that is also like our understanding of good, where good is sustainable and nurturing. Yeah. And so if I'm in an environment that I want to be sustainable and nurturing, well, clearly, if the person next to me is healthy, they're sustainable, and they're nurturing, they're not making the environment toxic or whatever, well, it will help sustain and nurture me. Likewise, me not being a toxic person helps and sustains and nurtures them. And there's plenty of that dynamic for how you go about doing stuff that just philosophically makes sense. And I'll say with my kid, there are plenty of times where he just wants to go outside. And
Mm-hmm.
going outside doesn't mean we're going to the park. He's 2. He doesn't know what a park is really. It's a place that
Yeah.
he likes, but how's that any different than the trivial things that he really likes too? Like he loves looking at cars. So would I say that my son without a doubt loves the park more than being on the sidewalk and watching cars go by? Of course not. so so sometimes when my kid wants to go outside, I ain't taking him all the way to the park. I'm just going out on the sidewalk and I'm walking up and down the street, or I'll walk to the corner store. There's all these communal places that the kid should just be able to healthily move around in and not go to like the designated play zone where, oh, we're going outside, we're going to the park. No, we're just going outside. Maybe we'll go to the park, but if I have to feel like whenever my kid goes outside, that means we're going to the park and I got to put him on the stroller and I got to bring this thing and that thing and go over there. That's me viewing my communal space as just like a series of different types of private spaces where like I live in this private space and that's inside.
Yeah.
And then outside is I'm going to this other private space that's dedicated to being outside. And it's no. Outside's outside.
Yeah.
And I will say, I definitely think I'm one of the few people in the neighborhood that you'll see me and my kid just hanging out outside on the sidewalk where he's just walking down the street and we're not going anywhere. It's just going to be a 10, 15 minute little having fun outside. Everybody else, you'll see they have their kid in the stroller and they're going to this thing, they're going to that thing, they're going to this thing. It's like, where are you going? Do you have all those appointments? That sounds like a lot of work. The kid doesn't know the difference. What's the point? But that's what happens when you view everything very individualistic privately. Where
it's like, yeah, compartmentalized,
Yeah.
I feel like, yeah.
Freedom exists in a series of private spaces and not in some sort of nurturing communal space. And so when philosophically that's how you're told to live in the world, if one of those private spaces is gone, you won't feel like you can go anywhere. You'll feel really lonely.
Yeah.
You won't.
Yeah, like work, for example, during the COVID pandemic.
Exactly. Work is gone.
Right.
And now they're stuck trying to figure out how to interact with other people. They don't know how to make friends or do all these other things that if your society's like healthy and functional should be pretty second nature. Well, they don't know it because it's all connected to work. And the work is gone.
Yeah.
And now people are depressed because they can't go to some place and make money for somebody else.
No, yeah. Yeah. So what else can we do, Barrett, to kind of like promote, developing like a cultural philosophical practice of being in community to kind of combat this like individualistic loneliness and individualistic society we kind of live in now? We spent some time talking about like disrupting this pattern of work being your only community, neighbors and neighborliness, I guess. What else can we, and how do you also practice this, being in like a sustainable, nurturing community?
Yeah, so it's the philosophical shift, and then that philosophical shift results in clearly a perspective shift, but also a linguistic shift. And so, we on this podcast talk a lot about just re-examining and like having a new perspective in relation to the word good, because it's a word that we say, but we don't really have a clarity about what it means. It's more of like a feeling.
Yes.
And so if good is sustainable and nurturing, now you start thinking about what do you need to sustain yourself as a person?
Right.
What are the things that I need to help nurture myself as a person? And then you cultivate those things. And those are things that you can cultivate wherever you are. And so, like I live in this neighborhood and I have a philosophical perspective that I think may be different than some of my neighbors. Like I can't speak for everybody. I'm not gonna sit here and say that everyone around me, they don't know what they're talking about. Like I have no clue. That wouldn't be a healthy way to look at it, frankly.
Right.
That'd be really sad. But the philosophy I have is it makes sense to know the people that I'm gonna see and interact with all the time. Know them, say hi, all that stuff. And I think it's really beneficial. I feel people know me. People say hi to me. I go into a place and they're happy when I walk in. They're like, oh, hey, that's a thing. That makes you feel good. It makes you like living in your neighborhood when you're just casually doing something. And like, for example, the UPS guy, because when COVID hit, clearly we're getting stuff delivered all the time. We're not going to the store.
Yeah.
So the UPS guy was dropping packages off all the time. And at one point I say, hey, what's your name? And it's funny, when you ask someone their name, they always think that you're like, have some sort of nefarious agenda. Like why do they want to know my name? There's like a hesitation. That's just, the nature of our society. But I just, what's your name? Just, he's like, oh, it's like, oh, cool. I'm Barrett. Nice to know you, And from that point on, the UPS guy always knows my name. And if I'm walking down the street and he's in his truck making a delivery, he honks, waves. That's pretty cool.
That's nice. Yeah, that is really cool.
So if you're just walking down the street, going to the convenience store, and someone honks their car at you and says, hey, and stuff like that happens all the time. And that's just, and I'm not doing it because I want people to honk and wave at me when I'm walking down the street. It's like, no, this is a sustainable, nurturing way to exist in the world. And you apply that wherever you go. Like, I say hi to all the people at the daycare. Just kind of stuff. You can make the adjustment by having that philosophical shift, and then you'll be empowered to apply it in the way that makes the most sense in your environment. And so I think that's a key thing. Another thing, and I think I'm fortunate in this, that like Andrea's a Mexican American, and so they have a different understanding of community that's not as like corrupted by the US. And Latinos also have more words that are just like in expressing the love of their community. So like a really popular word in Mexico is convivir, which if you translate it into English, they'd say something like hang out. But literally what it means is live together. So if you want to go hang out or do something with your friend or whatever, you'd say convivir. And so you'd be saying like, but that's the full verb. Clearly, if it's like, let's it'd be different.
You need to conjugate it. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And so with convivir, you're telling someone, let's go live together. Just think of how different we would perceive stuff if we said that in English. Like if you and I if you were in DC and we were going to go hang out, I wouldn't say, let's go grab a drink. I'd say, let's go live together. And that could include going to a bar. It could include getting a coffee. It could include all sorts of stuff. But it wouldn't be in this trivial, really meaningless phrase of hanging out. We're living together. As a kid, having a kid, there's an abundance of phrases where like they will just say that their kid is like my love. Like, look at that, huh? We don't really say stuff like that as much in American English. Like when I talk about my kid, I'll say that he's my buddy. He's
Yeah.
But that's not the same. And when I try to say stuff, when I try to be like, oh, you're my love, it doesn't seem natural. It seems like I'm trying to do something different, even though I know it's a good thing to do. But it means I have to exert like a concerted effort to say these phrases that are not normal in American English, but ones that I think do promote community more. Like they have a good phrase for boys, they say like mijo, and for girls it's mija. And like it's kind of like my son, my daughter, but it's really like emotive. It's kind of like, but also like you can call like a good friend mijo. You can call a good friend mija. They don't have to be your kid. And so like they use these like affectionate communal terms of endearment that are just natural with how you relate to other people. Or like you're viewing them as a part of you.
Right.
Like and an extension of your love for existence and other people.
Yeah.
We don't have phrases like that we use casually, like normally. I think that's a big problem. But to make those phrases, you at the bare minimum have to start thinking differently. And I think having this clarity about what good is helps you start thinking that way, where you start getting more empowered to maybe not like make a word, but maybe you feel more comfortable using a word like mijo or mija. Or, or maybe you translate convivir and you're like, let's live together. And you say that to your friends. I think that's how you start cultivating it, because we're really talking about, if you have a philosophy that makes an impact at a micro and a macro level. And so,
truly.
you know, this epidemic of loneliness that they were talking about, like that's a macro thing that's impacting people at a micro level all the time, because we have a philosophy that tells everyone to exist as an individual. And then they do that. And then they get really sad. And that sadness makes them sick and depressed, and they get illnesses, and they're doing it because we told them to. So we have to figure out how to tell people to do the opposite. And when you've been doing the wrong thing for so long, it really becomes hard to really articulate what the right thing even is. And I think, you know, the Surgeon General is pointing out the loneliness problem, but his solution is still quite individualistic, which it's an improvement, but you have to be able to articulate it more at a collective level, and how that collective level could impact policy and politics and at a macro level, but also just at an individual level. And I think we have a lot of work to do for that, but you can only start doing the work if you have the philosophy and the language to do it.
Yeah. And I mean, definitely sharing that philosophy with others, right? Because I think like it's important for you to develop that own philosophy yourself of like, this is how I'm going to practice, you know, sustaining, nurturing relationships with not just like others, myself, my community, family, work, you know, neighbors, etc. But it's also like, and you know, sharing that philosophy with others intentionally to have that greater impact, right? For them to acknowledge, oh, okay, so like you have this philosophy, I don't have a philosophy, or like my philosophy is non-existent at the moment, but it does get people, I feel like, to think more once you share, you know, your very intentional and proactive philosophy, for them to say, okay, you know, I've kind of been ghosting, or I've been on autopilot because of how everyone else has been interacting this way. And like, now I'm also going to develop a more proactive philosophy on this too. And I think that's really helpful.
And I think you said the key word in that is being intentional, which I will say at some point, once I started paying attention about how significant intentionality is to other people, it made me realize that like I don't know how to not be intentional. It's like it's a like, even when I'm not doing something, like I'm making a conscious decision to sit on the couch and watch TV. You know what I mean?
I see. Yeah.
Like it's not that like I'm doing something because I've become thoughtless and have like allocated that responsibility to something else, where I can just have an unintentional life. And community is intentional. Like you make it. Like it's a thing that you have to make and sustain.
Yeah.
It's all intentional. And I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday. So this is a good example. A good friend of mine, this guy named Kurth. He's good. He's definitely last handful of years just been going on an intentional journey to just better himself. And it's not like there was anything wrong with him. It's not like he had like a problem. It's just like, you know what? I'm just gonna try to be the best person I can be. I'm gonna be quite intentional about that. And so he definitely will make the effort to like reach out to his friends and this, all that kind of stuff. And so, I just went over to Kurt's house just to hang out yesterday, just to make sure that us as friends are taking that time to spend time with each other, because that's what we need to do to sustain the community that we've consciously decided that we want to exist in the world. Like we hung out with each other. We said, we like each other. We think the other person's cool. Let's make the effort to hang out with each other so we can remain friends. Because if we're unintentional about it, we just won't hang out. Like we used to have a workspace in the same place, and then COVID hit and we weren't going to the workspace anymore.
Right.
But we decided to stay friends. So we had to be intentional about interacting with each other.
Yeah.
And now we don't have a shared workspace at all. We're not going to have, the likelihood of us having a workspace in the same place is like slim to none ever again. So we go hang out. And I was telling him that like one of the key things about there's difference between good and bad is that it's just so much easier to do a bad thing than it is to do a good thing. Like it's easier to break something than it is to make something. And so if you don't have a clarity about what good is, there's a very high likelihood you're just going to unintentionally do bad stuff because they're just the easier things to do. And so like I was saying, like you and I are hanging out and we're both intentionally doing the stuff to make sure that we hang out. But if I all of a sudden got in a bad mood and punched you in the face, gone. Everything's over. Like the likelihood of us still being friends would be slim. You know what I mean? That was 1 second. Did that bad thing. Even if I said I did that bad thing and it wasn't intentional, just something came over me, over, And so like, a key component of all of this is just life is intentional. Like you actively are making something all the time. And that's it. The thing that you're making might not be glorious or something that's of note, but you're doing something. And the idea that you could just passively exist in the world where the responsibility for what you do is on something else. Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of circles back to the loneliness component where like it seems like a lot of people, the responsibility for their community, their connections was something else where they didn't consciously make that decision. But when work was removed from the equation, there was nothing that was helping them interact with other people. And the idea of being intentional and sustaining all of that stuff seemed really foreign to them. And I think our society encourages people to have that perspective. And like, that's a massive problem where you're encouraged to have like a passive relationship with your own existence.
Yeah, to be on autopilot. Yeah,
because like on autopilot, somebody else is driving. Like the computer's driving. Like if you put your car on autopilot, like the car is driving. So like even this idea of autopilot, it's like we want to believe that like I chose to be on autopilot and the pilot that's driving it automatically is also myself. And sure, sometimes like if you're driving a car and you just like make a right-hand turn because you always make a right-hand turn right there and you weren't like paying attention and you're supposed to make a left. Yeah, sure. I guess that's you being on autopilot. But like there's a lot of this autopilot that's somebody else is driving. And I think that's better than me driving myself. How does that make sense? You know, like,
It's easier. I don't know if
that's what people want to think, but then you get lonely and depressed, and now there's an epidemic of people feeling
who are
awful.
lonely. Yeah.
And it's like, no, it's not easier. But I'd say also another thing that's interesting is like driving and being intentional doesn't mean that you're always the leader. You can make a conscious decision to be a student. That's not necessarily like some oppressive, authoritative, submissive relationship. Like, no, I think I need to learn. We go to school, we go to universities, most people do, and you make a conscious decision to learn where you're not the teacher. So like choosing and being intentional doesn't mean that you're leading the whole time. It can be that I need to learn. I need to take a back seat and learn. And I'm intentionally making that decision. And then once I've determined that I've learned enough, I'll intentionally make a decision to go someplace else or do something else. And like that's a sustainable, nurturing way to go about stuff. Like at some point, you're always going to need to be a student. And hopefully at some point you could be a teacher. That's just how it works. So yeah, I think we started with loneliness. I think we talked about community to a decent extent, but it's just like,
yeah, let's think about like a phrase that we can reconstruct here with regards to either loneliness or community. I did like how you brought up hanging out and how, like, many folks who speak Spanish say convivir, to live together, instead of just like, let's just hang out, which feels very passive, but the live together feels way more intentional, active, affectionate. So I'm just trying to think of another phrase that we can reconstruct to think through, like, developing a better philosophy on community. And
so like one thing that I think about a lot is a lot of like the celebratory phrases within a community. If you think about them, they're really destructive. So like if you're doing something well, it's common for someone in your community to say that you're killing it or you're crushing it.
Yeah.
And it's like, we need to have like celebratory phrases that are nurturing, that are sustainable. Like killing something is clearly not sustainable. Crushing something is not sustainable. They're not nurturing. They're not good. And so like reconstructing phrases so that when someone does something celebratory, you actually respond in a constructive way and not a destructive way.
Yeah.
Like, I think that also...
So how would you reconstruct killing it and crushing it?
you could just say, like, you're doing a great job, or I love what you're doing. Just something as simple as that.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be something overly complicated where it's not like, all right, I used to say killing it. What's the word to replace with killing? It's like, no. Just, we're talking about the philosophy, the meaning behind the phrase. And so the meaning behind the phrase doesn't mean that like the new phrase is a derivative of the previous phrase. Like if the previous phrase is bad, just negate it, get rid of it, and have a new one that takes its place that doesn't have to derive from it. So yeah, just say like, I love that. Great job. You're so talented. Just things like that. And if you start thinking like that, now you're reconstructing everything. But man, it's so conflicting. And you say it, you say it to yourself. Oh, I crushed that. Oh, God.
Right.
No, I didn't. No, I didn't crush that. I really like did that really well. I put my full spirit in that or something like that. But it's that where you're changing the philosophy and then you just make a completely different phrase. So it's instead of saying hanging out, you'd say, let's live together. Completely different phrase, different philosophy, new perspective on how you see this stuff. And so yeah, I guess that's what I'd say. Something like that, where, you have the philosophical shift, and then that will cultivate the necessary linguistic shift.
I appreciate that. Thanks for helping us reconstruct those phrases, Barrett.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. I think we're good.
Well, thanks everyone for listening. Yeah. Be sure to follow us on socials at SCL_community and subscribe to The Word, which is our Substack newsletter. We also want to hear from you about what you want us to talk about next. Leave us a comment letting us know your thoughts and where you see ethnocide in the world, and also how you're reconstructing some of these destructive phrases too. Until next time, I'm Luna.
I'm Barrett. Thanks for coming.
Have a great one, everyone. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.